There is a name written on a white stone that no one in this room has ever heard spoken aloud. It was not chosen by your parents. It was not given to you at birth. It has never appeared on a document, a diploma, or a gravestone. And yet it belongs to you. Only to you. And the God who wrote it has been holding it since before the foundation of the world. We will get to that stone. We will get to that name. But not yet. First, I want you to imagine a different moment. A delivery room. The smell of antiseptic and something older than antiseptic. The ancient smell of new life arriving in a world that was not ready for it. A parent reaches into a pocket and pulls out a folded piece of paper. 9 months of waiting. 9 months of arguments about syllables, about family names, about the weight a name will carry into a classroom and a boardroom and a graveyard. And now, a breath. And then the name is spoken aloud for the very first time, into the ear of someone who cannot yet understand a single word of it. That moment, that act of naming, is one of the most profound things a human being ever does. Because to name something is to define it. To name something is to say, I see you. I know what you are. I know what you will become. God has been doing this since before time existed. But here is what separates the names God gives from every name a parent has ever chosen in a delivery room. Parents name the newborn. They hold a blank page and they write the first line. God renames the broken. He waits. He watches. He lets a person carry the wrong name for years, sometimes decades. And then, in the most unexpected moment, in the darkest place, at the bottom of the worst night of their life, he speaks. And the old name falls away like a dead skin. And what replaces it is not a correction. It is a declaration. This is not a story about linguistics. This is not a story about ancient Near Eastern naming customs. This is not a story about 5 people who lived thousands of years ago in a land most of us will never visit. This is a story about what God calls you when the name the world gave you no longer fits, when the name you have been answering to was never really yours to begin with. There are 5 name changes in Scripture that will reorder the way you see yourself by the time this is over. We begin with a 99-year-old man sitting in the door of his tent. The heat in the Negev desert in the middle of the day is not the kind of heat you push through. It is the kind of heat that stops you. It presses down on the top of your skull like a hand, and it says, sit, stay, do not move. So Abram sits in the door of his tent. He is 99 years old. His back is the back of a man who has slept on the ground for most of a century. His hands are the hands of a shepherd, cracked, sun-darkened, still strong, but no longer young. And in those hands, in that body, in that tent in the middle of the desert, lives the most painful irony in the ancient world. His name is Abram. In the Hebrew, Abram means, end quote, exalted father, end quote, father of greatness, father of heights. It is a noble name, a name that sounds like destiny when you say it out loud. And for most men, it would be a name worth carrying with pride. But Abram has no children. He has never had children. He and his wife Sarai have been trying, and failing, for their entire adult lives. And now he is 99, and she is 89, and the body does not lie. The math is not cruel. The math is simply finished. Every morning Abram wakes up and answers to a name that is a reminder of the one thing he has never been able to become. Exalted Father. Father of greatness. Of nothing. 24 years earlier, God had come to Abram in the dark and made him a promise. He had taken him outside the tent and told him to count the stars. End quote. So shall your offspring be. End quote. And Abram had believed it. The text says so, and it is one of the most extraordinary sentences in Genesis. He believed, and God counted it to him as righteousness. But that was 24 years ago, and the stars are still there, and the children are not. Here in Apos, that's what most people miss. When God finally speaks again, when he appears to Abram on that ordinary afternoon in the heat of the day, he does not begin with the promise. He does not begin with the child. He does not explain what took so long or why 24 years had to pass in silence. He begins with the name. End quote. No longer shall your name be called Abram. End quote. One sentence. And a man in Apos. S entire identity. The name his mother called him. The name carved into his story. The name that had followed him from Ur of the Chaldees across hundreds of miles of desert. Is retired. Set aside. Finished. End quote. Your name shall be Abraham. End quote. One syllable added. Haman. It means multitude. It means the noise of a crowd. It means the sound of more people than you can count, in a single afternoon. God takes the name and quote, exalted Father and quote, and breaks it open, and inside he plants the sound of a nation that does not yet exist. Of nations, plural. Not one. Not a tribe. Not a family line. Nations. He is 99 years old. His wife is 89. And God adds one syllable to his name, the sound of crowds, and calls it done. The Jewish historian Josephus records in his Antiquities that Abraham and Apos' reputation spread far beyond the borders of what would become Israel. His name, the new name, the impossible name, became associated with knowledge and civilization across the ancient world. A childless shepherd from the Negev became the father not just of a bloodline, but of a legacy that has shaped every major monotheistic tradition on the planet. One syllable, one added breath of sound, and the entire trajectory of human history bends. Now here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. Abram did not earn the new name. He did not achieve it. He was not renamed because he had finally demonstrated enough faith, or enough patience, or enough righteousness. He was renamed at 99 years old, broken down, childless, past the point of any natural possibility, because God had decided that the time had come to speak the future into existence. The name came before the child. The declaration came before the evidence. God renamed him as a father of multitudes while he was still a father of none. And then, the same night, he turned to Abram and said, "As for your wife, she is inside the tent." That detail matters. When God changes Abram and Apos' name, Sarai is not standing beside him. She is not part of the conversation. She is behind the curtain of the tent while the most important exchange of her husband and Apos' life happens 10 feet away from her, and she does not know it is happening. She has been waiting longer than Abram has. If Abram and Apos' name was a cruel irony, Sarai and Apos' life was a slow erosion. In the ancient Near East, a woman and Apos' worth was measured in children, not because that was right, but because that was the world. And Sarai had lived in that world for nearly 9 decades without the one thing the world said would make her matter. She had followed her husband out of Ur. She had followed him into Egypt. She had followed him across the wilderness, watching the promise stretch thinner and thinner across the years like cloth pulled too tight. She had heard the same promise Abram heard. She had believed it the way you believe something when you have no other option. And she had grown old waiting for it to arrive. And now God turns to Abram and says, "As for your wife," and quote, "As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name," end quote. Here is the thing that almost every translation misses, and it changes everything. Both names come from the same Hebrew root. They both carry the meaning of princess, of noblewoman, of one who rules. On the surface it looks like God changed almost nothing. Same root, same meaning. Why bother? And this is where it gets remarkable. The difference is grammatical, and grammar in Hebrew is not a small thing. Sarai carries a possessive suffix. It means, end quote, my princess, end quote, the princess of a particular people, a particular place, a particular context. A local title, a regional dignity. Sarah drops the suffix and takes the absolute form, not, end quote, my princess, end quote, but the princess. Not a noblewoman of one tribe, but a mother of nations. God does not change the meaning. He removes every limitation on it. He takes a word that was always true about her and makes it truer than it has ever been. She doesn't end Apos, hear it happen. She is still inside the tent. But God tells Abraham to use the new name from this moment forward. Which means the next time Abraham calls for his wife, the next time her name crosses his lips, something will be different. A word that has carried the weight of decades of waiting will sound ever so slightly new. And Sarai, who has been answering to her own name for 89 years, will not notice the change right away. She will just hear her husband and Apos' voice. She will just hear her name. And then one day it will land differently. She laughs. Later, when she overhears the strangers confirm the promise through the wall of the tent. She laughs the laugh of a woman who has been disappointed so many times that hope itself has become a kind of pain. And God hears it. He does not rebuke the laugh. He does not correct it or erase it or pretend it did not happen. He folds it into the promise. End quote. You shall call his name Isaac. End quote. Yitzhak. In Hebrew, he laughs. God names the miracle after the moment she doubted it. He takes her disbelief and turns it into a declaration. He takes the laugh that said this cannot be and writes it into the birth certificate of the child who proved it could. That is what the new name was always pointing to. Not a correction, not a rebuke. A tenderness so precise it could only have come from someone who had been watching her for 89 years and had not missed a single moment of the waiting. Stay with me. Because the next man who receives a new name from God does not receive it gently. He receives it in the dark, at the bottom of a river, with a broken hip, and he receives it fighting. Two names changed in a single night. A man who had been answering to the wrong name for 99 years. A woman who laughed at the promise and watched God fold her laughter into the miracle. Two people who had every reason to stop believing, and a God who renamed them anyway, before a single piece of the promise had arrived. We are not done. If these stories are doing something in you right now, subscribe, so you don't miss what comes next. Because the name change we are about to look at is the most violent, the most physical, the most visceral moment in all of Scripture. A man, a river, a broken hip, and a name he will carry for the rest of his life as a limp. You need to understand what kind of man Jacob was before you can understand what happened at the river. He came into the world fighting. His twin brother Esau was born first, but only just. Jacob followed seconds later, one hand wrapped around Esau and Apos' heel, as if he were trying to pull him back in. As if even in the first moments of his life he understood that the world had limited resources and he intended to take as much of them as possible. His parents named him for it. Ya and Apos, a kav, heel grabber, supplanter. In the bluntest translation, the word means deceiver. It was not a prophecy. It was a description. They named him for what he already was. And Jacob lived up to it for 40 years. He deceived his aging, half-blind father Isaac into giving him the blessing that belonged to Esau. He wore his brother and Apos' clothes so he would smell like him. He covered his smooth arms with goatskin so he would feel like him. He stood in front of a dying man and lied about who he was, and walked out of the tent with the birthright, the blessing, and a brother who wanted to kill him. He ran. He ran for 20 years, working for his uncle Laban in a foreign land, building a family, building flocks, building a life from the only materials he knew how to use, cunning, strategy, and the constant low hum of guilt that follows a man who has never stopped running from what he did. And now he is coming home. Esau is riding toward him with 400 men. Jacob has sent messengers ahead. He has sent gifts ahead, wave after wave of livestock, of wealth, of everything he has built in 20 years, trying to soften a brother he has not seen since he stole his future. And the night before the confrontation, Jacob sends his family across the ford of the Jabbok River. His wives, his children, his servants, everything he loves crosses to the other side. And Jacob is left alone. The text in Genesis 32 is one of the strangest passages in all of Scripture. End quote. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. End quote. That is all the introduction we get. No explanation of where the man came from. No description of his face. Just a man. And they wrestled. All night. In the dark. On the bank of a river that Jacob cannot cross until he has settled something that 20 years of running have never settled. But it gets stranger. The text says the man could not prevail against Jacob. A man who has spent his entire life losing things that mattered, running from things that frightened him, hiding behind disguises and deceptions. This man holds his own all night against a figure who has appeared from nowhere. And when the stranger sees that the fight is not ending, he reaches out and touches Jacob and Apos' hip socket. One touch, and the joint dislocates. Jacob is now wrestling with a broken hip in the darkness before dawn. And he does not stop. The stranger says, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." And Jacob, limping, exhausted, in genuine physical agony, says something that may be the most desperate and most magnificent sentence in the book of Genesis. End quote. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." End quote. 40 years of running. 40 years of taking blessings by force or by fraud. And now, at the bottom of his worst night, with everything he loves on the other side of the river and everything he fears riding toward him on the other side of the dawn, Jacob finally asks. He does not grab. He does not scheme. He asks. And the stranger, who is no stranger, and who Jacob will later say was God himself, asks him a question. Not because he does not know the answer, because he wants Jacob to say it out loud, in the dark, at the bottom of everything. End quote. What is your name? End quote. And Jacob says it. And Apos, a kav, deceiver, heel grabber. The man who took what was not his and ran from what he owed. He confesses what he is. This is not a story about a wrestling match. This is not a story about a river. This is not a story about a man with a dislocated hip and mud on his face in the hour before sunrise. This is a story about what happens when you stop running long enough to let God ask you the question he has been waiting to ask for 40 years. What is your name? What are you, really, underneath all the cunning and the strategy and the disguises? What do you call yourself when there is no one left to deceive? And the moment Jacob answers, the moment the old name leaves his lips for the last time, the stranger speaks the new one. End quote. Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. End quote. Yisra and Apos. One who strives with God. One whom God strives with. The scholars have argued for centuries about which direction the verb runs, whether Israel means the man who fought God or the man God chose to fight for. The answer, almost certainly, is both. It is not a promotion. It is a wound turned into a title. Jacob walks away from the Jabbok River with a new name and a permanent limp. Every step he takes for the rest of his life will be a reminder of the night he refused to let go. Every step will announce to anyone watching, this man met God in the dark. This man came out the other side. The limp is the proof. And the name he carries, Israel, will become the name of an entire nation. 12 sons, 12 tribes, a people who will bear forever the name of the night their father was too stubborn to quit. Pay attention to this, because the next man Jesus renames has never wrestled anyone in his life. He is a fisherman. He smells like the sea. He says the right thing for the first time in his life in front of a cliff face above a cave the locals call the gates of hell, and Jesus renames him on the spot, before he has done a single thing to deserve it. Caesarea Philippi is not an accident. Jesus does not wander into cities. He moves with intention, and the intention here is unmistakable to anyone who has ever stood at the base of that cliff face and looked up. Caesarea Philippi sits at the foot of a massive wall of rock, pale limestone, sheer and enormous, with a cave cut into its base that drops down into darkness so deep the locals believed it had no bottom. They called it the Gate of Hades, the place where the dead went in and did not come back out. The Greeks had built a temple to Pan here. The Romans had built a temple to Caesar. The whole city was a monument to powers that claimed to be eternal. This is where Jesus brings his disciples and asks the question, end quote, who do people say that the Son of Man is? End quote. The disciples answer with names, John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. Safe answers. Scholarly answers. The kind of answers you give when you are not sure what the right one is, and you do not want to be wrong in front of everyone. And then Jesus narrows it. End quote. But who do you say that I am? End quote. The silence that follows that question is the kind of silence that has weight. 12 men who have walked with this teacher for months, who have watched him heal the sick and calm a storm with 3 words and feed 5,000 people with a boy and Apos' lunch. 12 men who know more about who he is than anyone else on earth, and not one of them speaks. And then Simon opens his mouth. End quote. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. End quote. 6 words. The most important 6 words any of them will ever say. And they come from a fisherman, not a priest, not a scribe, not a theologian trained in the schools of Jerusalem. A man who made his living pulling fish out of the Sea of Galilee. A man with a temper and a tendency to speak before he thinks, and a long history of saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment. This time he says the right thing. And Jesus stops and looks at him and says something that no one in that group is prepared for. End quote. You are Peter. End quote. Petros, in Greek, rock. In Aramaic, the language Jesus is almost certainly speaking, Kepha, Cephas. Not a pebble, not a stone you could hold in your hand. A boulder, a foundation stone, the kind of rock you build on. End quote. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. End quote. He says it standing in front of the gate of Hades, standing in front of the cave that supposedly had no bottom. He looks at a fisherman from Galilee and says, the thing that has no bottom will not win. Not against what I am building, not against what you are becoming. Here is what makes this name different from all the others. Abraham was renamed at 99, after a lifetime of waiting. Jacob was renamed at the bottom of his worst night, after 40 years of running. Both men had histories that at least gestured toward what God was calling out of them. Peter has done nothing yet. He will sink walking on water. He will fall asleep in Gethsemane. He will deny Christ 3 times before the rooster crows, warming his hands at a fire in the courtyard while Jesus is being beaten 30 yards away. He will go back to fishing, as if the whole thing never happened, after the crucifixion. And yet Jesus names him rock before any of that. Before the sinking and the sleeping and the denying and the running. He names him for what he will become, not for what he is. The name is not a description. The name is a prophecy spoken into a man who does not yet have the faintest idea what it will cost him to grow into it. Eusebius records in his ecclesiastical history that Peter was executed in Rome under Nero, crucified, as tradition holds, upside down. Peter asked to be crucified inverted because he said he was not worthy to die in the same position as his Lord. The man who once denied knowing Jesus in front of a servant girl died, insisting the world know exactly who he belonged to. He grew into the name. It took years. It took failure and restoration and the breath of the risen Christ on his face on a beach in Galilee and a question asked 3 times. Do you love me? 1 for each denial. But he grew into it. The rock that once sank held the church up. There is one more thing. Because every name change we have looked at, Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, Peter, belongs to a specific person in a specific moment in history. And you may be sitting with a quiet, uncomfortable thought right now. A thought that sounds something like, that is a beautiful story about someone else. I want to take that thought and turn it over. Because the last name change in all of Scripture is not about someone else. It is addressed to you. The island of Patmos is a piece of black volcanic rock dropped into the Aegean Sea like an afterthought. It is small, about 13 square miles. It is isolated. The Romans used it as a place to send people they wanted to silence without the inconvenience of executing them publicly. You put a troublesome person on Patmos, and the sea does the rest. No followers. No crowds. No churches gathering in living rooms to hear him speak. Just rock and water and wind, and the slow erosion of everything a man has built his life around. The man they send there is old. He is the last one left. Peter is dead, crucified upside down in Rome. Paul is dead, beheaded on the Appian Way. James is dead. Andrew is dead. Every man who stood with Jesus at Caesarea Philippi. Every man who sat at the table in the upper room. Every man who saw the risen Christ with his own eyes, gone. Killed, most of them, for refusing to stop talking about what they had seen. And John, the last apostle, the one Jesus loved, the one who stood at the foot of the cross when everyone else had run. John is on a rock in the middle of the sea. Alone. Exiled. In his 90s. Waiting to die. And then, on an ordinary Sunday morning on that black volcanic island, the voice finds him. John describes it in the first chapter of Revelation. A sound like a trumpet. A sound like rushing water. A sound like nothing he has ever heard before and nothing he has words for now. He turns to see where it is coming from, and the sight drops him to the ground like a dead man. The risen Christ, not the carpenter from Galilee, not the teacher on the hillside, but the risen, reigning, white-haired, fire-eyed, voice like thunder Christ, stands in the middle of 7 lampstands and speaks. He speaks to 7 churches. He speaks to their failures and their faithfulness and their compromises and their endurance. And then, at the end of the second letter, to the church in Pergamum, he says something that has never been said anywhere in Scripture before. And quote, to the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone, with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. End quote. A white stone. In the Roman world, a white stone meant 2 things, and both of them matter here. In a Roman courtroom, the jury cast white stones for acquittal and black stones for condemnation. To receive a white stone was to walk out of the courtroom free, declared innocent, charges dropped, the past no longer held against you. And at Roman banquets and games, a white stone was an admission ticket, a personal invitation to a feast, proof that the host knew your name and had saved you a seat. God gives both at once. You are acquitted, and you are invited in. But it is the name on the stone that stops everything. A new name, written on the stone, that no one knows except the one who receives it. Not a family name, not a tribal name, Not a name that belongs to a nation or a movement or a church. A name that belongs to one person and one person only. A name so personal, so precisely fitted to the exact shape of who you are, that it cannot be shared, cannot be borrowed, cannot be taken. This is the name planted in the opening of this video. This is what God has been holding since before the foundation of the world, since before your parents were born, since before the language existed that would be used to speak it, since before the first star was lit in the sky above the Negev desert where an old man sat in the door of his tent and waited for a promise. He has been holding your name, not your earthly name, not the name your parents chose in a delivery room with a piece of folded paper and 9 months of hope. The name that captures what he sees in you that no one else has ever had the eyes to see. The name that says, I know what you were. I know what you have done. I know every version of the wrong name you have answered to. And none of it is what I call you. Augustine wrote in his Confessions, Our heart is restless until it repose in thee. He wrote it in the 4th century, and it has never stopped being true. Every name we chase in this life, success, relevance, legacy, the approval of people whose names we will forget, is a substitute, a placeholder, a name-shaped object that almost fits but never quite does. Because the name that fits, the only name that has ever been cut to the exact dimensions of who you are, is the one on the white stone. And it will not be spoken until the moment it is placed in your hand. Think about the parent in the delivery room one more time. 9 months of waiting. A name folded in a pocket. Spoken for the first time into the ear of someone who cannot yet understand it, but will. Who will grow into it. Who will one day look back and think, yes, that is who I am. That is what I was always becoming. God has been waiting longer than 9 months. He has been waiting since before time itself, holding a stone with your name on it, for the moment when you are finally ready to receive it. Abraham waited 24 years. Jacob wrestled all night with a broken hip. Peter denied the name of Christ 3 times before breakfast, and God renamed every single one of them. He has not run out of new names.